The airport was bustling, filled with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and impatient travelers sighing in long lines. The smell of coffee from overpriced kiosks mixed with the sterile scent of the terminal. She stood there, calm, composed, and dressed in a way that turned heads, not because she was out of place, but because she belonged in places most people didn't expect her to. She moved with confidence, with the quiet power of someone who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. But power means nothing to those too blind to see it. "Ma'am, I need to see your ticket again." The voice was sharp, condescending. The kind of tone reserved for someone they had already decided was less than. She turned, already aware of what was happening. The uniform. The posture. The way his eyes barely hid his preconceived judgment. "I already showed it," she said, her voice even. "Well, I'm asking again." A shift in the air. People in line stopped fidgeting with their phones, their attention subtly shifting toward the scene. A few furrowed their brows. Others exchanged quick glances. They knew. They had seen this before. A slow inhale. She kept her composure. "I don't see anyone else being asked to show theirs twice." The officer's smirk was the kind that made stomachs turn. "Well, maybe no one else here looks as suspicious as you." And there it was. The unspoken truth spoken aloud. Her jaw clenched, but she kept her expression unreadable. Years of experience had taught her that reaction was a luxury. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, pulling it from her bag with deliberate slowness. "You're welcome to read it again. If you need help with that, I can." She didn't get to finish. Because in an instant his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with an authority that wasn't his to hold. The collective gasp was instant. A ripple of shock, disbelief, anger. "What the hell are you doing?" a woman behind her hissed, pulling out her phone. But the officer's grip only tightened. "You're holding up the line. Step aside." And then he shoved her. Hard enough for her to stumble back, her bag slipping from her grasp. The force sent it tumbling to the ground, spilling its contents: lipstick, wallet, phone, sunglasses. And something else. Something small. Silver. Undeniable. A badge. Her badge. The kind only carried by the top executive of the entire airline. The officer's smirk faltered. His grip loosened. His eyes darted to the badge, to the name engraved in the steel, to the undeniable truth. The gasps around them shifted into something else. Anticipation. Realization. Horror. Passengers lifted their phones even higher. Someone whispered, "Oh, he's done." She dusted off her sleeve with deliberate grace, as if shaking off the weight of years of people like him. Then she lifted her gaze. "You have no idea what you just did." And the officer? He knew, in that moment, that whatever came next would be far worse than anything he had imagined. But what would it be? Would she let this go? Would she unleash everything she had worked for and make him pay? Or would she take a different kind of justice? One thing was certain. Karma doesn't wait. And justice? Justice was just getting started. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to say this: Plow of Twist stands firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or abuse of power. This story is not just a tale, it's a reflection of real struggles faced by Black people every day. If you've ever been judged unfairly, know that you are seen, valued, and powerful. Now, get ready for an intense story with drama, justice, and a twist that will leave you speechless. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a mind-blowing plot twist. Let's dive in. Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was a maze of motion, suitcases rolling, hurried footsteps echoing against polished floors, the scent of roasted coffee blending with the artificial coolness of air conditioning. Flight announcements droned from overhead speakers, their mechanical tone barely registering among the crowd. It was a place of transitions, where goodbyes were whispered, and reunions erupted in joyful exclamations. A place where first-class travelers reclined in leather seats behind tinted glass, while economy passengers waited in restless clusters, watching the privileged walk ahead with ease. Among them, standing with an air of quiet confidence, was Ava Sinclair. She wasn't just any traveler, she was a woman who had built her success from the ground up. A black woman in an industry where people like her were rarely seen at the top. CEO of one of the biggest airline companies in the country, her journey had been anything but easy. It had been a war, one fought with intelligence, unshakable determination, and an iron will. Ava had learned long ago that power was something people like her had to prove, not inherit. Every boardroom she had stepped into had been filled with men who second-guessed her competence before she even spoke. Every decision she made had been scrutinized twice as hard. Yet, she had risen anyway. Not just risen, dominated. Dressed in an elegant navy blue pantsuit, her posture was effortless, her expression unreadable. She didn't flaunt her wealth the way some did, but everything about her commanded respect. The sharp cut of her blazer, the subtle glint of a diamond-studded watch, the poised way she held her leather tote, it was enough for those who understood power to recognize it. But power, she had learned, was invisible to those who refused to see it. And today, in this airport, someone was about to make that mistake. Across the terminal, Officer Mark Calloway scanned the crowd with a casual authority that bordered on arrogance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed buzz cut, he wore his uniform like a badge of invincibility. The Atlanta PD patch was stitched onto his sleeve, but his real authority came from something deeper, an unchecked sense of superiority, the kind that had been reinforced his entire life. Mark had been in law enforcement for over a decade, and in that time, he had learned something about people. He could tell when someone was trouble. He prided himself on his instincts, convinced he could read a person's worth within seconds. And right now, his attention had locked onto her. She stood near the first-class boarding line, unfazed by the chaos around her. She didn't fidget with her phone like the others. She didn't glance around nervously. No, she stood too still, too composed. That was the first sign something was off. And then, there was her ticket. Mark's eyes narrowed as she handed it to the flight attendant. First class. He had seen plenty of well-dressed black women before, but something about her set off a trigger in his mind. She was too polished, too confident. And that bothered him. Because he had seen who usually flew in first class, corporate executives, celebrities, politicians. People who, more often than not, didn't look like her. He felt the old assumptions creeping in. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she was trying to sneak into a seat she didn't pay for. Maybe she was using someone else's ticket. Or maybe, just maybe, she was someone who thought she was above the rules. Mark didn't hesitate. He made his way through the line, his presence alone causing some people to step aside. The badge on his chest gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights. His voice was sharp when he spoke. "Ma'am, I need to see your ticket again." Ava turned slowly, her gaze meeting his with calm precision. She didn't flinch. Didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked annoyed. "I already showed it," she said, holding up the ticket. Mark didn't even glance at it. Instead, he studied her. The way she held herself, the way she didn't shrink under his scrutiny. It irritated him. There was no fear, no nervousness. Just an infuriating certainty that she belonged here. "Well, I'm asking again," he said, his voice edged with something sharper. Ava's jaw tightened. She had dealt with this before. A lifetime of it. The condescending tone. The extra scrutiny. The silent accusation woven into every interaction. And yet, she never got used to it. "You're the only person asking," she said coolly. Everyone else got through just fine. Mark smirked, shifting his stance slightly. A challenge. Maybe no one else here looks as suspicious as you. A hush fell over the people in line. A few of them tensed, their eyes darting between the two. The implication was crystal clear. The humiliation sat heavy in the air. Ava didn't blink. Control. Composure. Calculated silence. That was how she had survived in boardrooms full of men like him. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, her voice unwavering. "Would you like to inspect it for a third time? Maybe even a fourth?" The sarcasm laced in her words made Mark's jaw clench. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by someone like her. He felt something bubbling under his skin. An urge to put her in her place. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with more force than necessary. The collective gasp from the passengers around them was immediate. The world seemed to slow for a fraction of a second. Phones were already rising, cameras rolling. But Mark didn't notice. His focus was on the way she refused to react. She didn't shrink back. Didn't beg or plead. She just looked at him. "You're holding up the line," he snapped. "Step aside." And then, before anyone could process what was happening, he shoved her. The impact wasn't enough to knock her down, but it was deliberate. A display of dominance. A message. Her bag hit the floor, contents spilling onto the polished tile. Lipstick. Wallet. Sunglasses. And then, a glint of silver. A badge. Not just any badge. The CEO's badge. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His breath hitched. The weight of realization crashed over him like a wave. The passengers who had been recording murmured among themselves. They knew what this meant. Knew what would come next. Ava straightened her suit, dusting off her sleeve with a deliberate slowness. When she finally met his gaze again, her expression had changed. No more patience. No more diplomacy. Just cold, unshakable certainty. "You have no idea what you just did." And Mark? Mark had just made the worst mistake of his life. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of realization settling in. People stood frozen, eyes darting between Ava and Mark, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and, for some, silent satisfaction. The shift in energy was palpable. Moments ago, he had all the power. Now, it was slipping through his fingers like sand, and he felt it. Ava adjusted the lapel of her blazer, her movements precise and deliberate. It wasn't about vanity, it was about control. She had spent years perfecting the art of measured responses, knowing that in situations like these, the slightest misstep could be used against her. But this? This was different. She wasn't the one under scrutiny now. Mark, on the other hand, was struggling to process what had just unfolded before him. His grip on authority had been so absolute, so ingrained in him, that the very idea of being wrong, especially in such a public and humiliating manner, was something he wasn't equipped to handle. His gaze flickered to the badge on the ground, the metallic glint mocking him. CEO. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs growing around him. A flight attendant stepped forward hesitantly, her professionalism wavering as she looked between them. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Her voice was cautious, unsure. Ava finally turned her attention away from Mark, her expression still unreadable. "I'm fine," she said, her tone smooth but carrying an edge. "Though I can't say the same for your airport security. Quite an interesting way to treat first-class passengers." The flight attendant's face paled. She knew. They all knew. This was bad. Mark took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to take control of the situation, but he no longer knew how. He had never been on this side before. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The crowd was watching, recording, waiting. He turned to his fellow officers stationed nearby, searching for backup, for someone to step in and shift the balance of power back in his favor. But the looks on their faces were not what he expected. None of them moved. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others looked uncomfortable. As if they wanted to disassociate from him entirely. Because they understood something Mark hadn't, this wasn't going away. There was no spinning this. No justification. No report that could be twisted to make this look like protocol. This was clear as day. And it was on camera. Ava finally picked up her badge, brushing off invisible dust as she examined it for a moment before slipping it back into her bag. Then, for the first time, she really looked at him. Not the way she had before, when she was just another black woman trying to keep her dignity intact in the face of abuse. This time, she looked at him the way she looked at corporate competitors who thought they could outmaneuver her in a boardroom. The kind of look that preceded consequences. "You," she said slowly, her voice dropping just enough for the surrounding spectators to lean in. "Just made the biggest mistake of your career." Mark bristled. His pride, the same arrogance that had led him to this moment, still clung to him like armor. He straightened his posture, his jaw tightening. "Ma'am," he forced out, grasping for anything to salvage his authority. "I was just doing my job." Ava tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Really? Your job? And what exactly is that?" "Physically assaulting paying customers because they don't fit your expectations of a first-class passenger." Mark's nostrils flared. He felt cornered, an unfamiliar sensation that he wasn't sure how to handle. His hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to keep them there. "You are being uncooperative," he snapped, grasping at any excuse, any reason that could justify what had just happened. Ava let out a breath of laughter. Not out of amusement, but astonishment. She shook her head slightly, lips curling in a humorless smirk. "Uncooperative," she repeated, her voice coated in disbelief. "You mean I didn't bow my head and say, 'Yes, sir,' the way you expected me to?" Mark swallowed hard. The murmurs around them grew louder. More phones lifted. More eyes burned into his skin. He could feel the situation slipping, spiraling, and there was no undoing it now. A man in a navy suit stepped through the crowd then, his pace hurried, his expression taut with stress. Paul Whitmore, the airport's director, his presence alone confirming just how bad this situation had gotten. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to de-escalate with polite corporate neutrality. No, he looked at Mark like he had just single-handedly set the terminal on fire. "Ms. Sinclair," Paul addressed, his voice measured but tense. "I sincerely apologize for," Ava held up a hand. "Not now." The dismissal was so sharp, so unapologetic, that Paul flinched. Ava wasn't interested in his carefully rehearsed corporate damage control. Her attention was still on Mark, and he knew, that whatever happened next was entirely in her hands. "You know," Ava continued, her voice thoughtful, "this could have been different. You could have apologized. Could have taken a step back and realized that maybe, just maybe, you overstepped. But you won't. Because men like you." She took a deliberate step closer, lowering her voice just enough for him to feel the words. "You don't learn until the world forces you to." Mark's heart was hammering in his chest. Every survival instinct in his body was screaming at him to get out of this, fix this, do something. But for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do. Ava glanced around then, her gaze sweeping across the sea of recording phones, the evidence stacking against him in real time. Then she looked past him, directly at the other officers who had stood by, waiting to see how this would play out. "Are you arresting me?" she asked, her voice carrying just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because if not, I believe I have a flight to catch." The weight of her words hung in the air. The officers hesitated, exchanging glances. None of them moved. None of them even attempted to step forward. Because they knew. The power had shifted. Ava turned without another word, walking past Mark as if he were nothing. But before she disappeared through the boarding gate, she stopped just long enough to deliver the final blow. "I'll see you soon, Officer Calloway." And Mark, for the first time, truly understood. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cold, sterile lighting of the Atlanta Police Department's disciplinary hearing room cast sharp shadows across the polished mahogany table. The room wasn't grand, nor was it particularly large. It wasn't meant to be. It was designed for accountability, a place where men like Mark Calloway had to sit across from the people they never expected to answer to. He sat stiffly in his chair, fingers intertwined so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His uniform was crisp, freshly pressed, but no amount of polish could erase the weight that now hung around his neck like a noose. Across from him, a panel of senior officers and legal advisors murmured amongst themselves, flipping through pages of reports, reviewing footage that had already exploded across every major news network. The viral video had taken less than 3 hours to spread like wildfire. The footage was damning. The shove. The condescension. The way he gripped her wrist like he owned her. But most of all, the moment his arrogance shattered into pure, undeniable fear when Ava Sinclair's badge hit the ground. Mark's mouth was dry, his pulse an uneven drum in his ears. He had been here before, in disciplinary meetings, answering for complaints that had never actually gone anywhere. The difference was that those cases had been contained, filed, ignored, dismissed. This one wouldn't be. The door opened, and the room fell silent. Ava Sinclair walked in, her presence so controlled, so deliberate, that Mark felt his stomach knot instantly. She didn't need to announce herself. The power shift had already happened long before she stepped foot in this room. She took a seat opposite him, smoothing the sleeves of her tailored blazer. Unlike him, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't even angry anymore. And somehow, that was worse. Paul Whitmore, the airport director, sat beside her, clearing his throat. "Ms. Sinclair, we appreciate you taking the time to be here today," he started, his voice careful. "I want to personally extend," Ava raised a hand, silencing him. "Let's not waste time with apologies." Her gaze never left Mark. "I want to hear from him." The panel members exchanged glances. Mark's throat constricted. He knew he had to say something, but what? He had no defense, and any attempt at one would only make things worse. He opened his mouth, searching for words that didn't exist, but Ava spoke first. "Officer Calloway," she said, her voice even, devoid of any of the rage she had every right to unleash. "Do you know how many times in my life I've been stopped, questioned, treated like I didn't belong somewhere I worked my ass off to be?" Mark blinked. The room was suffocatingly quiet. "I lost count a long time ago," she continued, tilting her head slightly. "The difference is, most of the men who did it never had to sit across from me after." Mark shifted uncomfortably, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room burning into him. His palms were damp. "I won't ask if you're sorry," Ava continued. "Because I don't care. I don't care about your regret, your explanations, your excuses. What I care about is justice. And I'm going to make sure you get exactly what you deserve." His chest tightened. "Ms. Sinclair, no," she cut him off smoothly, shaking her head. "You don't speak until I'm done." Mark clenched his jaw. He had never felt this helpless before. "I could have pressed charges immediately," Ava went on. "I could have made sure you were in handcuffs before you even left that airport. But I wanted you to sit with it. I wanted you to feel this fear, this uncertainty, this helplessness. Because that's what men like you force people to feel every single day." Mark's stomach churned. "I made a call," she said, her tone casual now, as if discussing paperwork rather than his entire career. "To my legal team. To my board. To my contacts. And you know what's funny? Turns out, when a major airline CEO has a public case like this, it tends to get attention. And not just from the media. Paul Whitmore, who had been sitting tensely beside her, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ms. Sinclair has, exercised her rights as a victim of this incident. The department has, agreed to proceed with disciplinary actions. Disciplinary actions. The words sent a cold spike through Mark's spine. Ava leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "You're not walking away from this," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried weight. "You think this is just about me? It's not. It's about every single person you've ever treated like they were less than you. Every single one who didn't have cameras recording. Who didn't have power. But I do. And I'm using it." Mark swallowed hard, gripping the armrests of his chair to stop his hands from shaking. "The footage has been submitted as evidence," Paul added. "You are officially under investigation for excessive use of force, misconduct, and discrimination. The board will also be reviewing past complaints against you." Mark's pulse spiked. Past complaints. He knew what that meant. He had gotten away with too much, too many times. If they started digging, there was no coming back from this. Ava tapped her nails against the table once, a rhythmic reminder of her control over this moment. "And while you're dealing with that," she continued, standing up slowly, adjusting her blazer, "you should know that I've also reached out to several organizations dedicated to holding law enforcement accountable." She smiled, but it was cold, sharp, victorious. "Let's just say, your face is going to be everywhere." Mark's breath was shallow now. This wasn't just a disciplinary action. This was a dismantling. His career. His reputation. His life. Paul cleared his throat, barely able to meet Mark's eyes. "Officer Calloway, you are hereby placed on unpaid suspension, effective immediately. Pending the investigation's outcome, termination is highly likely." Mark felt the words hit him like bricks. Suspension. Termination. Unpaid. He could barely process it before the final blow landed. Additionally, Paul hesitated, then continued, "Due to Ms. Sinclair's formal complaint, legal charges will be filed. You are expected to turn in your badge and weapon today." Mark felt the world tilt. His ears rang. His fingers went numb. This wasn't just a scandal. He was about to lose everything. His job, his pension, his future, and now. Now he was looking at criminal charges. Ava picked up her bag, casting him one last glance before heading toward the door. She didn't need to say anything else. Her victory was already absolute. But just before stepping out, she paused. "You thought you were invincible," she murmured without turning back. "Turns out, karma works faster than you thought." And with that, she was gone. Mark sat in a suffocating silence, the weight of his ruined life settling over him like a storm he never saw coming. The walls of the disciplinary hearing room seemed to close in around Mark as the words suspension, termination, criminal charges echoed in his head. His chest tightened, his mind racing to find some loophole, some escape route that didn't exist. He had never been in a situation where he wasn't in control. Not once. And now, sitting here, feeling completely powerless, was something he had never prepared for. Ava was gone. The second she walked out of that door, she had left behind the wreckage of his career, his pride, his future. But the damage was still spreading. Paul Whitmore cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly in his chair. "Officer Calloway, you will be required to return your badge and firearm immediately. An internal affairs officer will escort you to your precinct where you'll complete the necessary paperwork." Mark's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. His entire identity, everything he had built, was slipping through his fingers, and all because of one moment. One decision. One mistake. His stomach twisted violently. One of the senior officers at the table, Captain Reed, leaned forward, his face unreadable. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, that could turn this around. But what was there to say? That he was sorry. That he hadn't meant to push her. That he had only done what felt right in the moment. None of it mattered. The silence stretched, and Reed sighed. "Very well. Officer Calloway, you are dismissed." Dismissed. Like he was nothing. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of every set of eyes watching him. His feet felt heavy as he turned, pushing open the door. The moment he stepped into the hallway, reality hit him like a freight train. A sea of reporters. Cameras flashing. Microphones shoved toward him. The hallway, once a quiet corridor leading to the main precinct, had turned into a battlefield. "Officer Calloway, do you regret your actions? Do you believe the punishment is justified? How do you respond to Ava Sinclair's statement about holding officers like you accountable?" The voices blended together, the chaos swallowing him whole. He tried to push forward, but every step felt like he was sinking deeper. The world was watching. Every move he made was being recorded, analyzed, dissected. A firm grip landed on his arm. He turned sharply, expecting another reporter, but instead found Internal Affairs Officer James Carter, his expression stone cold. "This way," Carter muttered, steering him away from the cameras. Mark's pulse was pounding in his ears. They moved quickly, exiting through a side door into the precinct's parking lot. It was quiet, eerily so, the muffled chaos of the press still lingering in the background. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Carter didn't let go of his arm. "Keys." Mark blinked. "What?" Carter's stare was unforgiving. "Your patrol car. Turn in your keys." Mark's fingers twitched. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to fight back, argue, defend himself, but what was the point? Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the keys. Carter snatched them from his grip without hesitation. "Your badge." Mark's breathing turned shallow. He had worn that badge for 15 years. It had been his shield, his identity, his proof that he mattered. And now, in a single moment, it was being ripped away. His fingers trembled slightly as he unclipped it from his uniform. He hesitated for just a second, then dropped it into Carter's waiting hand. His chest felt hollow. "Your firearm." Mark's throat tightened. He wasn't just being suspended. He was being stripped down, erased. With stiff movements, he unholstered his gun, placing it into the open evidence box Carter held out. Carter snapped the lid shut. "You're officially relieved of duty. Do not return to the precinct unless instructed by your attorney. You are expected in court next week for the formal charges against you." Mark let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Court. Right. Because I'm a criminal now, huh?" Carter didn't react. "If you have any questions, direct them to your legal representative. You're free to go." Free to go. Mark had never felt less free in his life. He turned on his heel, walking toward his personal car, feeling the weight of every step like it was dragging him down. His hands were shaking by the time he yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. His head fell against the steering wheel, his breath uneven. He had never thought, never once imagined, that this would be his reality. A sudden vibration from his phone made him flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulling it out with numb fingers. His screen was flooded with messages, missed calls, notifications. His name was everywhere. He hesitated before clicking on one of the news alerts. The article loaded instantly. Officer Mark Calloway under investigation for assaulting airline CEO. Internal review reveals previous complaints of racial bias. His stomach twisted as he scrolled down. There were statements from past civilians, people who had crossed his path before. People who had complained, but never been heard. Now they were speaking. And the world was listening. His hands clenched around the phone. His vision blurred for a second before he forced himself to breathe. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. And the worst part? He had done this to himself. The weight of everything crashing down on Mark Calloway's life wasn't immediate. It didn't hit him all at once like some dramatic realization in a movie. It was slower, more insidious. A creeping, suffocating force that settled in piece by piece, moment by moment, until he could no longer breathe under its weight. At first, there was denial. His mind clung desperately to the belief that there was still a way out, that this wasn't permanent, that he could fight back. There had to be a loophole, a technicality, something. But every time he reached for a lifeline, it dissolved between his fingers. His lawyer was blunt, the evidence was overwhelming. The department wasn't standing behind him. The public was against him. And the worst part? He wasn't just facing professional consequences anymore. He was facing prison. The charges were official now. Aggravated assault. Civil rights violations. Abuse of authority. The public outrage had ensured that this wasn't just going to be some quiet suspension followed by an early retirement. The system that once protected him, the network of silence and unaccountability that had always been his shield, had collapsed in on itself. Because this time, the world was watching. The fallout spread like wildfire. He lost everything. His pension, gone. His legal defense, draining him of every dollar he had saved. The house. He had to sell it just to keep himself afloat, just to pay for the endless legal fees that stacked up faster than he could handle. His wife, the woman who had once stood by him through everything, packed her bags and left without looking back. Not because she disagreed with him, but because she knew there was no future left for them. His friends, the ones he had drank with, worked with, shared jokes with, suddenly became distant. Some stopped answering his calls altogether. Others only offered half-hearted sympathy, their voices filled with thinly veiled discomfort. They didn't want to be associated with him, didn't want his downfall to taint their careers. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. And then there was the public. He couldn't go anywhere without the stares, the whispers, the disgust. His face had been plastered across every major news network, every social media platform. Memes. Editorials. Discussions. Some called him a disgrace. Others called him exactly what he was. A racist. A thug with a badge. A man who had finally been held accountable. He tried to ignore it. Tried to pretend that he could still move through the world like before, that he could walk into a grocery store without feeling the burning eyes of strangers watching him. But it was impossible. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some muttered under their breath. Others weren't as subtle. He walked into a diner one morning, trying to pretend like things were normal. The moment he sat down, a man at the next table scoffed and muttered, "Surprised you're still walking free." Mark clenched his jaw, keeping his head down. He didn't respond. The waitress who came to take his order barely looked at him. When he asked for coffee, she hesitated for just a second too long before scribbling it down. When she returned, she placed the mug in front of him without a word, then walked away as fast as she could. People knew who he was. And they didn't forget. But the worst part? The worst part wasn't the strangers. It wasn't the news coverage. It was the ones who used to respect him. It happened at a gas station late one night. He had kept his head down, moving quickly, grabbing a pack of cigarettes and a six-pack of beer. When he reached the counter, the cashier looked up and froze. The recognition was immediate. Mark didn't say anything. He just reached for his wallet. The man behind the counter, a younger black man in his mid-20s, just shook his head and let out a small, disbelieving laugh. You really thought you'd never have to answer for it, huh? Mark stiffened. You think any of us are surprised? The man's voice was low, calm, but cut deeper than any shouting ever could. This is just the first time you couldn't get away with it. Mark swallowed hard, dropping the money onto the counter. The man didn't touch it. Take it and go, he muttered, his tone sharper this time. Mark grabbed the bag and left, his hands shaking. It wasn't about just this case anymore. It wasn't just about Ava Sinclair. It was about all the people before her. All the times he had gotten away with pushing too far, abusing his authority, targeting people just because he could. He had told himself it was just the job, that he was just keeping order. But deep down, he had always known what he was doing. Now he was paying for it. The trial date approached quickly. His lawyer tried to convince him they could reduce the sentence, negotiate a deal. But Mark knew there was no escaping this. The evidence was too strong. The public pressure was too overwhelming. Ava Sinclair had made sure that this wouldn't disappear into some forgotten news cycle. She had made sure that he would face consequences. The night before the trial, he sat alone in the small apartment he had rented after losing his home. The walls were bare. The fridge was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the street outside. For the first time, he let himself really feel it. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't indignant. He wasn't blaming the system or the media or the people who had turned on him. He was just empty. Because deep down, he finally understood. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. That his badge gave him the right to judge, to control, to decide who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. But now he was the one being judged. And this time, there was no getting away with it. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that held weight, the kind that suffocated. Mark Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His lawyer murmured something beside him, but the words barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, stuck in the endless spiral of how everything had led to this moment. The judge's entrance broke the tension, a sharp reminder that this was real. The gavel's echo sent a shudder down Mark's spine, a noise so final it felt like a nail sealing his fate shut. The prosecutor stood, his movements slow, deliberate, as he made his way to the front. The way he carried himself, with confidence, with certainty, it made Mark sick. Because he knew, that man had already won. Ava Sinclair sat just a few rows back, composed, unshaken. She wore the same expression she had that day in the disciplinary hearing, not angry, not smug, just certain. It was the kind of certainty that came from knowing justice was inevitable. She didn't have to fight for this anymore. The world had already seen the truth. The prosecutor turned to face the jury, his voice steady, unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about speculation. It is not about misunderstandings. It is about abuse of power. About an officer who believed himself to be above the law and who, for far too long, acted without fear of consequence. But today, consequence is here. Mark's stomach twisted. He had sat through trials before, but never like this. Never from this side. He was used to the uniform, the authority, the unspoken understanding that officers would protect their own. But now he was nothing more than a man on trial, a man being judged just like all the people he had once looked down on. The prosecutor turned toward the screen where the video played again. Mark flinched as he watched himself, watched the moment that had unraveled everything. The arrogance in his stance. The dismissiveness in his voice. The way he grabbed her, the way he shoved her, the way he spoke with the assumption that he was untouchable. He couldn't look away. The footage ended, leaving behind a heavy silence. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself not to react, because every set of eyes in that room was waiting for him to break. The prosecutor turned, his gaze sharp, cutting through Mark like a blade. That is the man sitting before you today. A man who acted without fear of consequences, without hesitation, without remorse. And today, we ask that justice be served. Mark's lawyer stood, his defense already weak before it even began. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of protocol. He grasped at straws, trying to paint a picture where Mark wasn't a villain, but a man who had made a mistake. But no one in the room was buying it. Then, it was Ava's turn. She walked up to the stand with the same grace, the same unshakable presence that had followed her into every boardroom, every space where she had been forced to prove herself. And now, she didn't have to prove anything. Her voice was calm, steady. That day, I wasn't surprised by what happened. And that's the real problem, isn't it? That I wasn't surprised at all. I was just tired. Tired of the expectation that I had to smile through it, that I had to accept it. Tired of men like him thinking they could push us aside like we don't belong. Mark stared at the table in front of him, his pulse pounding in his ears. You see, this wasn't just about that moment, Ava continued. It was about every moment that came before it. About every person who was told they were overreacting when they spoke up. About every complaint that was ignored. About every time people like him walked away without consequences. Her eyes found Mark's. He didn't move. But this time, she said, voice lowering just enough for the room to lean in, this time, it didn't just disappear. This time, the world saw. Mark felt those words settle in his chest, pressing down, crushing him in a way he had never experienced before. Because she was right. The judge turned to Mark. Officer Calloway, would you like to speak before sentencing? Mark's lawyer tensed beside him, probably hoping he wouldn't. But something in Mark had already broken. He knew there was no fighting this. No outrunning it. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. I spent my whole life believing I was the good guy, he said, barely recognizing the sound of his own voice. That my job made me right. That I had control, that I was keeping order. But I wasn't. I was just doing what I could get away with. A hush fell over the room. I don't have an excuse, he continued, his throat tightening. I don't have some story about how I was just following procedure. I wasn't. I saw her, and I made a decision. A decision I can't take back. He looked at Ava then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see her as an obstacle. He saw her as the woman whose life he had tried to diminish in a single moment, because he thought he could. I'm sorry, he said, and this time, it wasn't just a hollow phrase. It wasn't damage control. It was real. Ava watched him for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded once. Not forgiveness, not acceptance. But acknowledgement. The judge exhaled slowly, then looked down at the file before him. Given the severity of the charges, the evidence provided, and the impact of this case, the court has reached a decision. Mark's breath caught. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole in 3. Additionally, you will be permanently banned from serving in any law enforcement capacity again. It was over. Mark barely felt the officers grab his arms, barely processed the sound of the gavel hitting the wood. He didn't fight it. Didn't resist. He had nothing left to fight for. As they led him away, he looked back once, catching one last glimpse of Ava. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She was simply watching, the same way the world had watched him fall. The prison intake process was mechanical, stripped of any humanity, as if the people going through it were nothing more than names on a list, bodies to be processed and locked away. Mark Calloway had spent years on the other side, watching men just like him, sometimes guilty, sometimes not, being stripped of their belongings, their dignity, their sense of control. He had never once thought it would be him standing in that cold, sterile room, lifting his arms as an officer patted him down, feeling the sharp sting of metal as handcuffs were removed only to be replaced by something far worse, the suffocating reality of his new identity. He had seen men resist before, fight against the inevitability of their sentence, curse and plead and insist that this wasn't where they belonged. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stood there, numb, as the guard handed him a faded orange jumpsuit and motioned toward the small metal bench. He sat down, the weight of his own collapse pressing into his chest. A younger officer, probably no older than 30, glanced at the file in his hands before looking at him. There was no sympathy in his eyes. "Calloway," he said flatly. "You got assigned to D block. You're gonna want to keep your head down." Mark didn't respond. He just took the folded jumpsuit, nodding once before he was led to a small, gray-walled cell. The heavy door clanked shut behind him, the finality of it hitting like a punch to the ribs. The first few days inside were a blur, a haze of routine stripped of anything personal, anything that made him feel like a man rather than an inmate. Wake up. Count. Meals that tasted like cardboard. More counting. More watching. Always watching. Because if there was one thing he knew from his years in law enforcement, it was that men like him, cops turned inmates, were the lowest on the food chain in prison. He wasn't safe. He had spent his career seeing these men as criminals, as people who deserved to be here. Now, they saw him for what he was, a traitor, a man who had once held power and lost it all. He caught the stares, the sideways glances, the slow recognition in the eyes of those who remembered his face from the other side of the law. It didn't take long before one of them approached. Late one evening, after dinner, Mark was making his way back to his cell when a voice stopped him. "Look at this." The great Officer Calloway. He turned slowly, his stomach twisting as he took in the sight of a man he remembered all too well. Andre Porter. He had arrested him years ago, back when he still thought he was untouchable. A petty drug charge. A resisting arrest claim that had probably been stretched into something worse just because Mark could get away with it. Andre had done time, gotten out, then landed back inside for something else. But he hadn't forgotten. Andre took a slow step closer, his smile sharp, mocking. "Man, I gotta say. I didn't think I'd ever see you in here. What happened? Your little police buddies couldn't keep you safe?" Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. There was no good answer. Andre chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't that something? You used to walk around like you owned the streets. Now you're just another inmate, just like the rest of us." Mark held his ground, but he could feel the tension, feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how this played out. Andre leaned in just slightly, his voice lower now. "You scared, Calloway?" Mark met his gaze, forcing himself not to look away. "No." Andre studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "You should be." He walked away, leaving Mark standing there, feeling something he hadn't truly felt before. Fear. Not the kind that came with a dangerous situation or a high-stakes arrest. Not the kind that came with uncertainty or bad press. This was different. This was real fear. Because for the first time in his life, there was no badge to protect him, no system to shield him, no authority to hide behind. He was just another man in a cage. Days passed, then weeks. The press moved on, the world outside continued spinning. But inside, nothing changed. Every morning was the same. The same routine. The same faces. The same lingering awareness that he was vulnerable in a way he had never been before. And then, one night, everything shifted. He was lying on the thin, stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, when he heard footsteps outside his cell. A guard's voice, low, almost casual. "Calloway. You've got a visitor." Mark sat up slowly. A visitor? He hadn't expected one. There was no one left who wanted to see him. No family. No friends. No one who still cared. He was led down the hallway, through the familiar metal doors, into the visitation room. The second he stepped inside, he froze. Sitting at the table, waiting for him, was Ava Sinclair. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen her since the trial. Since the moment everything had collapsed. She looked the same, composed, powerful, every inch the woman who had walked into that courtroom and sealed his fate without ever raising her voice. He sat down across from her, unsure of what to say, unsure if he was even allowed to speak first. Ava studied him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over the prison uniform, the weariness in his face, the unmistakable shift in who he was. Finally, she spoke. "So. How's it feel?" Mark swallowed hard. "How's what feel?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "Being the one without power. Being the one who has to watch his back. Being the one who knows the world doesn't care what happens to him." His throat felt tight. "You came all this way just to say that?" Ava leaned back, crossing her arms. "I came because I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to look you in the eye and know that you finally understand." Mark let out a slow breath. He did. He really did. Ava's voice softened, just slightly. "Tell me something. If you could go back to that day, back to that moment in the airport, would you do it differently?" Mark didn't even hesitate. "Yes." Ava studied him, searching for something in his face. Then, slowly, she nodded. She stood up, pushing the chair back smoothly. "Good." Mark watched as she turned to leave, as she walked toward the exit with the same quiet authority she had always carried. Just before stepping out, she paused, her back still to him. "You're exactly where you deserve to be." And then she was gone. Mark sat there, staring at the empty chair, the weight of her words settling over him like a chain he would never be able to shake. Because she was right. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he deserved to be. The years passed in slow, heavy increments, marked by the monotony of prison life and the brutal reality of being on the lowest rung of the hierarchy. Mark Calloway had learned to survive in silence, to keep his head down, to endure the cold glances and the occasional moments when someone felt like reminding him of who he used to be. The first year was the hardest, when the whispers followed him down every corridor, when men he had arrested made sure to remind him of his fall from grace. But time had a way of dulling even the sharpest blade of humiliation. Eventually, he was just another inmate, another man wearing orange, another person whose past meant nothing inside those walls. He thought about Ava Sinclair more than he wanted to admit. Not because he was angry, that emotion had burned out long ago, but because he finally understood what she had meant. About power. About consequence. About how easy it was to wield authority when you never had to answer for it. He had believed himself to be a man of law, a protector of order. But in the end, he had only ever been someone who took what he could get away with. And when that was stripped away, when he had to sit in the same cells where he once placed others, he realized the truth. He had never been the hero. He was released after serving 4 years, getting out on good behavior. There was no welcome party, no family waiting, no friends offering a ride home. He stepped out of those gates with a small plastic bag of his remaining belongings and the crushing weight of a life that no longer existed. There was no returning to what had once been. No precinct that would take him back. No world that would pretend this never happened. So he disappeared. Ava never thought of him again, not in any meaningful way. He was just another name in a long list of men who had thought themselves invincible, another example of how time had a way of correcting its own mistakes. Her life continued upward, her position as CEO cemented not just in title but in influence. The scandal surrounding the case had made her name synonymous with change, with accountability. She took it further, using her platform to push for new policies within the airline industry, working with civil rights groups to ensure no one else would have to experience what she had. She didn't do it for revenge. She didn't do it to prove a point. She did it because she had power, and she knew what to do with it. Her career flourished. She became more than just an executive, she became a force, a woman whose presence in rooms demanded attention, whose words carried weight far beyond boardrooms. People listened to her now. They had no choice. And Mark? Mark found himself on the outside of a world that no longer had a place for him. Jobs wouldn't take him. His record followed him wherever he went. He tried construction, warehouse work, places that didn't ask too many questions. But the whispers always followed. The looks of recognition. The disgust. It was one thing to lose a job. It was another to lose the right to walk unnoticed. One night, he found himself outside a community center in a neighborhood he had once patrolled. He sat in his car, watching the people come and go, young men, some who had probably been stopped by him at some point, people he never gave a second thought to when he wore his badge. He didn't know why he was there. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something deeper. He sat for what felt like hours before finally stepping inside. The man at the front desk barely looked up. "You need something?" Mark hesitated before speaking. His voice felt different now. Smaller. I'm looking for something to do." The man raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Mark let out a slow breath. "I don't know. Just, something useful." The man stared at him for a long time, studying him, deciding something in that moment. Then, with a small nod, he gestured toward the back. "We need help with the mentoring program. Some of the guys need someone to talk to. Someone who's seen both sides of it." Mark almost laughed at the irony of it. A few years ago, he would have scoffed at the idea of mentoring the same kind of people he once saw as nothing but problems. Now he was just grateful someone was willing to let him try. Months passed. Then years. He never became anything notable again. His name never resurfaced in headlines, and he preferred it that way. He spent his days talking to people who had never trusted the law, people who looked at him and saw someone who had once been the problem. But for the first time, he wasn't hiding from it. He told the truth. About what he had done. About what it cost him. And some of them listened. Some of them didn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was, for the first time, he was trying to do something good. And Ava? Ava thrived. She never spoke his name again. Never wasted another thought on whether or not he had learned his lesson. She didn't need to. Because she had one. And she had made sure the world was a little less forgiving to men like him. So now, let me ask you this. What do you think justice really looks like? Is it punishment? Is it revenge? Or is it something else entirely? Mark Calloway thought he was untouchable. That the badge on his chest meant he would never have to answer for the way he treated people. But justice has a way of correcting itself, doesn't it? It doesn't always come quickly. It doesn't always come the way we expect. But it comes. And in the end, power always shifts to where it belongs. If you made it this far, tell me, what would you have done in Ava's place? Would you have forgiven him? Or would you have made sure he fell just like she did? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that will leave you speechless. See you in the next one.